On July 17th, 1983, 8 days after Michael is found, another person goes missing in the same section of Roan Mountain. And I've got to say, their story sounds an awful lot like Michael's. So on July 17th, 1983, Larry Davenport, who is a 20-year-old avid hiker, decides to head up to Roan Mountain with a couple of his friends to go on a hike. They really liked the western side of Roan Mountain. They were very eager to get up to the top where they could have a picnic before the sun went down. So they make it up to this section of the mountain where it's actually a campsite, and it's not that far from where Michael went missing. And there's picnic tables and there's little barbecues. You can put in charcoal briquettes and have your own little barbecue. They get up there and they set up their picnic on one of the picnic tables. And they're having a great time. They're joking, they're laughing. And at some point, Larry takes off his shirt and his shoes. And the weather was pretty good. It wasn't super hot out, but it was decent enough that no one thought it was odd that he was taking off his clothes and maybe kicking back and relaxing, enjoying the nice weather. Then at some point, out of nowhere, he stands up and he starts walking over to the tree line because they were in a bit of a clearing. And as he's walking over, one of his friends would later say that it seemed odd if he was going to relieve himself in the tree line that he wouldn't take his shoes, because the risk of stepping on something and puncturing your foot's pretty high. It was only in retrospect that this friend thought of that. At the time, his friends didn't think twice. He's getting up to relieve himself. He'll be back in a minute. After a few moments, when Larry did not come back, somebody turned around to see what he was doing, and they saw him walking in a straight line away from them well into the forest. This is a thick forest. It's not somewhere you're going to go walking barefoot without a shirt on. And he is way into the woods at this point. The friends have this moment of shock. Even if he needed to relieve himself, he would have done it much closer to the edge. So they're staring at him, thinking like, this isn't really happening. He's gonna turn around and come back. When he didn't, somebody yelled like, hey, Larry, what are you doing? Doesn't turn around, just keeps walking. So they get up and they start walking over. They're yelling to him, expecting him to turn around. And then at some point, he's far enough away that they can't even see him anymore. So they start running into the forest, yelling for him to stop and to come back. But as they got farther and farther in and they couldn't find him, they began to get worried that they were going to get lost. And so they decide, after about an hour of just yelling for him and kind of peering around to hopefully get a look at him, thinking he might just come back because there was no explanation for this, they eventually called the authorities. Authorities are able to very quickly launch a massive search in this area, very similar to the search that was launched for Michael, except without military involvement. But it was just as many people, hundreds of people, scouring this area. He doesn't have shoes on, he doesn't have a shirt on. And so they're banking on the idea that even though he's walked off for some reason, he can't go very far. It's gonna take a minute, but they're gonna find him because he can't escape the search party. But he does. And after 3 days of not finding this guy, despite this massive effort, people are baffled. But on the third day, a very strange but lucky break in the case occurred. 8 miles away from where the search is happening for Larry, a group of hikers called into police that they had seen a man walking around them wearing only what they described as a bed sheet. He was probably not wearing a shirt. They didn't know if he had pants on or not, but they could see that, his shin down had nothing on it and he had no shoes on, and he had this bed sheet wrapped around him. And he wasn't coming towards them. He wasn't threatening them in any way. He just looked like there's something wrong with this guy. Somebody needs to collect this guy and see what's going on. And so the police go over, and sure enough, it's Larry. When police got to Larry, he was visibly shaken, confused. He didn't really even know why he was there. He didn't know why he had this bed sheet wrapped around him, which it would turn out to be a large curtain, not a bed sheet. He did have a few scratches on his body, but probably not as many as they anticipated him having, considering the distance he had covered. 8 miles through thick rhododendron thickets. He should have been covered head to toe in cuts, but he wasn't, but he had a few. So the first thing they did is they brought him to a hospital, and he was diagnosed with something called acute brain syndrome, which is a term that refers to a host of psychiatric conditions that are temporary and diffuse over time that are caused by head injury, drugs, or infection. Basically, he was totally mentally unstable, but it would get better over time. Once he stabilized a bit, investigators asked him, what happened? So Larry wasn't sure why he left his friends, but at some point after leaving his friends, he wound up at this abandoned cabin. And he describes the cabin and he says where it is, and He said he went in the cabin and he didn't have clothes on, so he pulled one of the curtains off one of the windows and he wrapped it around himself. And he was there for a bit before ultimately leaving the cabin, and then he was discovered. And so investigators, they had a bunch of issues with this because, number one, how do we account for you traveling 8 miles? Because what you've just described is not an 8-mile journey. You're talking about a very short journey. In addition, where you described this cabin is an area that was heavily searched by the hundreds of people that did the search, and no one saw a cabin. And certainly if they had, they would have searched the cabin. It is the most obvious place that someone lost in the woods would go. There's no cabins in that area. So where was he? And where did he get the curtain from? And so just like the Michael Reel case, where the boy is found and he's healthy, and so everyone looks past the weirdness of his discovery and his story because he's alive, that's what happened to Larry Davenport. Very strange story. Don't know what you're doing walking around with a curtain on you, and I don't think that cabin exists, but you're alive, so we're okay with it. No one really did much research into the weirdness around these two stories. But David Paulides and the Missing 411 team said it's pretty difficult to overlook the fact that in a very short period of time, two different people that didn't know each other, that were not interacting in any way, went missing in roughly the same area, Roan Mountain, North Carolina side, under the same circumstances. They suddenly got up and walked away inexplicably. There's no trace of them. Dogs can't pick up their scent. Then they show up and they're kind of confused about how they got there, but here they are. And then they describe the same cabin that they found themselves being drawn to and staying inside of for significant amounts of time before being found again. That seems like too much of a coincidence to just write off. So, I would like to hear what you think happened to these two people. Was the cabin a hallucination? And if so, how did they both evade such a massive search effort? Or was it real? And who was the person in the cabin with Michael? In many countries, there are large sewer pipes that run directly underneath the streets that work their way down all the way to treatment plants where our waste is disposed of. Workers who maintain these pipes need a way to get down into them, and so they use what are called manholes, which are these intentionally cut vertical shafts that are just wide enough that a full-grown man could get through it. And usually when you pull the lid off, there is a ladder on the inside of the shaft that allows the worker to actually climb down safely and reach the bottom, which is the sewer pipe. Now, not every manhole goes down to the exact same depth. In fact, it varies pretty dramatically because the sewer pipes actually function on gravity, and so the closer you get to its final destination where the flow is actually going, so treatment centers, the deeper the manholes are going to get, whereas at the top of the sewer pipe it'll be much shallower. And so you're going to have a huge range of the depth of these manholes. In some cases, like in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, right near their treatment center, there are manholes that go hundreds of feet down that people walking through Milwaukee, Wisconsin would step right on top of the cover, not knowing that they're standing over this massive chasm. But speaking of the covers that sit on top of these manholes, if you've looked down in any developed city, you've seen a manhole cover. They are those big cast iron circular lids that are usually in the middle of the street or sometimes right on the sidewalk. These lids are there specifically to protect us from falling into a manhole, because obviously that would be a very bad day if you were to fall in. And so the lid, that big lid, is extremely heavy for that reason. They don't want people being able to lift them off or cars hit them and knock them out. So they're very, very heavy. That's the protective measure number one. And the second protective measure is the lid is round on purpose. It can't flip and then go down into the circular shaft. It sits on a lip, and so no matter how you flip it around, it will be too big to fall through the hole. But those two protective measures only work if the lid is actually doing its job and is on top of the manhole cover. Sometimes when workers need to go into the manhole, they have to obviously remove the manhole cover, and all of a sudden you have this huge hazard. And so normally in places like New York City, anytime there is work being done in a manhole and that cover needs to come off, they will block off the entire section of the street with tape and signs that basically tell people stay away from this area. There is an open manhole and it can be fatal if you fall inside. And by and large, people listen and they don't go anywhere near the manhole. But these precautions sometimes can't save everyone. On September 30th, 2019, 41-year-old Cesar Cortez was drunk in New York City, and he was stumbling around when he came across a worksite where there was an open manhole. In his inebriated state, he barged through the yellow tape and pushed aside signs and walked directly onto the worksite. And CCTV picked him up at 2:30 in the morning, wandering through the worksite right towards the open manhole, and sure enough, he walked right over it and disappeared and fell 20 feet to the bottom. It would turn out the crew that was responsible for working in this manhole had recently come out and they were getting ready to leave for the night, and there was just this perfect window of time where Cesar basically wandered in and no one saw him. And so shortly after he fell, the workers came back over to the open manhole. They put the cover back on top because they did not know Cesar was down there and he wasn't calling out to them, and they left. It would be 2 weeks before this crew came back to this worksite to do more work inside of the sewer. And so when they opened up the manhole cover, they were hit with this horrifying smell that even by sewer standards, this was truly putrid and disgusting. And so they backed up for a second, and then they went back over to the lip and they looked down, and to their horror was Cesar Cortez laying at the bottom, clearly deceased, being consumed by sewer rats. While the medical examiner has not come out and given an official cause of death for Cesar, there is some gruesome speculation that perhaps he survived the fall into the manhole but was knocked unconscious, and that's why he wasn't able to yell up for help, and then the lid went back over, and then he was trapped in this pitch black sewer with no help coming, no one knows he's down there, and he's surrounded by thousands of very hungry rats. Jay Austen was born in New York. He attended the University of Delaware for his bachelor's degree, and then he earned his master's degree from Georgetown. In 2009, while he was studying at Georgetown, he met Lauren Gagan, who was a student there as well, and they became best friends before ultimately falling in love. Jay and Lauren were avid cyclists. They biked to work every single day, and they had actually been on one long bike commute together through Iceland. And then in 2017, they decided, you know what? Let's go on an international bike trip. Let's quit our jobs and just go explore the world on two wheels. The two started a blog, and even before they had set out on this trip, they began detailing why they were going on it in the first place. And one of their main reasons was they were tired of corporate America. They didn't like being a part of that rat race, and they felt like they were giving up their youth to go punch the clock every single day. But their true underlying motivation for doing this international tour was because they wanted to use their blog to showcase human kindness around the world. So in July of 2017, when Jay and Lauren were both 29 years old, they flew to Africa to begin their journey. 6 months later, they found themselves in the mountains of southern Spain, and things were starting to get desperate. They had been cycling all day through these wicked mountain passes, and at some point, they had gotten lost. And so they pulled over, and they're arguing with each other about what they should do because there's freezing rain coming down, all their gear is soaked, their socks are soaked, they're miserable. And so they finally decide, after bickering for a while, that they have to keep going on because they hadn't passed any buildings or any people before. And so their best chance is to just keep going in hopes you find civilization at some point. And so they start making their way back up this hill when all of a sudden Lauren's tire pops, but their hands were so numb from the freezing temperatures and the rain, they couldn't make repairs. And so they're sitting on the side of the road. They can't go anywhere. There's no people, there's no buildings, there's nothing around them. It's freezing, and the temperature is dropping rapidly as the sun sets, and now it's snowing on them, and they're looking at each other like, what are we gonna do? Suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, this white van comes screaming around the mountain pass, comes out of the snow, and it just emerges in front of them. The door flies open, and this guy they've never met before named Ricardo tells them, get in, get in. And because of the situation they were in, they really didn't have any other choices, and so they hopped in his car. The heat was blasting. He immediately gave them towels and blankets and food and drink, and he said, I saw you guys earlier, and I wanted to make sure you were okay. Afterwards, he drove them to his house where he brought them inside, and he gave them more food and more water. He took their clothes and put them in the dryer, and he told them they can stay as long as they needed to. And Jay and Lauren are just unbelievably thankful because they know they were in a life and death situation, and this stranger saved them. And then to top it all off, the next morning when they got up and it was time for Jay and Lauren to head to the bus station, Ricardo insisted that he give them a ride to the station, which was an hour away. And then when they got there, he gave them 100 euros to make sure they had enough money for their bus fare. It was just a staggering level of human kindness that Jay and Lauren were caught off guard by, but in a way, they believed humans were fundamentally kind and that over the course of this journey, they were going to meet some incredibly kind and amazing people, and Ricardo was evidence of that. And for the most part, over the course of their journey, they became very accustomed to strangers being incredibly kind to them. Like on day 319 when they were in Kazakhstan and a man randomly approached them and gave them ice cream bars and just said bye and walked away. Or on day 342 when they had pitched their tent in the middle of this meadow in Uzbekistan and this family came up to them with string instruments and they played a concert for them. And on day 359 when two girls wearing pigtails met them at the top of a pass in Kyrgyzstan to give them bouquets of flowers. In one of their final blog entries, Jay wrote that evil was a made-up concept and that generally people are wonderful, generous, and kind, and that this was the most important revelation that he or Lauren have had on the entire trip. Then came July 19th, 2018, day 369 of their journey, the day that everything would change. At the time, the couple was in southwestern Tajikistan. While generally speaking, Tajikistan is considered to be relatively safe, there are definitely pockets within that country that are very dangerous because of terrorism. And one of those areas is southwestern Tajikistan, where Jay and Lauren were, which is right on the border of Afghanistan. So while Jay and Lauren, along with 5 other foreign tourists they had met, biked in formation down this panoramic stretch of road, a carload full of 5 ISIS fighters spotted them. These 5 fighters had recently filmed themselves saying they were going to slaughter the disbelievers, and so unfortunately Jay, Lauren, and the other 5 tourists were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The fighters came down onto the road and they began gunning it straight for these 7 cyclists, and right as they're about to pass them, they turned and barreled right into all 7 of them, knocking a number of them off of their bikes. The car left and turned around and came back up the road and ran over the now wounded and helpless cyclists that are scattered all over the place. And then after that, they hopped out and they attacked them with knives. Out of the 7 cyclists that were attacked, 4 were killed, 2 of which included Jay and Lauren. As for the attackers, the Tajikistan forces tracked them down and killed 4 of them, caught the 5th one, and he's in jail for life. On New Year's Eve 2005, a group of teenagers in Odessa, Ukraine, headed out to find a place they could celebrate. They decided a good spot for their party would be the entrance to the very creepy and off-limits stone mines that were underneath their city. These mines are massive. We're talking over 2,500 kilometers of these hallways that go all over the place underneath Odessa and well outside of the city limits. And many of these pathways underneath the city are unmapped, they are collapsing, or they're flooded. Despite all the entrances to the stone mines being sealed off in 1917 when they permanently shut down the mines, people in Odessa are well aware that there are a number of working entrances all over the city. Over the years, a number of murderers have used the mines to hide bodies and to hide out from the law. After World War II, Nazi soldiers were brought down into the mines to be executed. And there's been at least 3 different instances of kids sneaking into the mines and then never coming out again. And so with its grisly history, parents in Odessa would tell their kids, do not go down into the stone mines. Even if you find an entrance that works, it's just not worth it. But of course, this only led to the kids of Odessa wanting to explore these stone mines more. And so on this particular New Year's Eve night, this group of teenagers thought, tonight's the night we should go poke our heads in the mines. One of the teens that was part of this group was a girl named Masha, and she wasn't particularly keen on exploring the mines, but she wanted to go out and have a good time, so she tagged along with the group. These teens all went to the same school, and it was kind of common knowledge at their school that there was this one particular working entrance into the mines that was just outside of school property. So the teens walk over to this entrance, and what it looks like is 2 big metal doors in the ground that swing open like a cupboard, and then there's a flight of steps that lead down into the mines. One of the teens reached for the door handle and they turned it, and it turned, and then he yanked on it, and it opened. And so it was, in fact, a working entrance into the mine. And so they opened up both doors and they kind of took up positions on the steps. They were not quite ready to venture down into the mines. They just wanted to have the doors open and be near the mines. And then for the next hour or 2, they started drinking alcohol and having a good time. And periodically they'd get brave and they'd walk a little ways down into the mine only to turn right back around and come back to the steps. And so that's how it went for most of the night. And it seems like they were having a really good time. Later in the night, Masha was very intoxicated and she needed to go to the bathroom, but there was nowhere to go. And so she went downstairs and walked into the mines for some privacy. After a while, her friends realized Masha wasn't with them anymore. And so someone said, oh, I heard her talking about needing to use the bathroom. And so she probably just headed home already to use her bathroom at her house. And so in their drunken state, they were like, yeah, there's no way she's down in the mine. I'm sure she's fine. And so they just leave. But Masha didn't go home. She went down into the mine where she relieved herself. And then afterwards, for reasons we don't fully understand, she decided to continue to explore the mine on her own without a flashlight. Now, we need to remember that she was heavily intoxicated, so that obviously played a role in her decision-making process, but for whatever reason, she started walking into the mine and very quickly she got turned around. These are very confusing corridors, and so presumably she started to panic and began running to get back to the entrance, but unfortunately she ran the wrong direction and she went farther and farther and farther away until she was several miles from the entrance. She has no food, she has no water, she has no light, she has no cell phone service. She's got no way out. The following day, Masha's friends went over to her house to check on her to make sure she got home okay. But when they talked to her family, they said, no, she hasn't come home yet. I thought she was with you. And that's when her friends explained what happened, that they thought maybe she had left, but maybe she was still inside of the stone mines. And so they called authorities who went to the same entrance they had been at the night before, and they began looking for Masha, but it's a 2,500 kilometer stretch of area where she could be anywhere, and the authorities know that. And so very quickly, when they don't find any sign of her, they call up the search and they say, look, the only way she's getting out of here is if she finds her way out again. But unfortunately, Masha did not find her way out again. Instead, she spent 3 days wandering around these mines in total darkness until she eventually collapsed and died of dehydration. 6 months later, Masha's body would be discovered by urban explorers who had pushed several miles into one of the most unexplored sections of the mine. When she was discovered, it looked like she had been crawling on her hands and knees, giving the impression that to her very last breath, she had been desperately trying to find a way out. Fair warning, if you start looking into this story, you're almost certainly going to run into the picture of Masha after she was discovered inside of the mines. It's a very graphic picture and there's not really any warning before you see it. So if you Google this, be prepared to see that image. On the evening of August 17th, 2005, 21-year-old Stephen Hunley was having dinner with his 5 friends when somebody mentioned the secret cave. Having grown up in Provo, Utah, Stephen and his 5 friends had all heard the legend of the cave that was up in the mountains near Brigham Young University, where supposedly in the back of this cave, there was this underwater tunnel that led to a back room where there was this air pocket inside of which, dark rituals and human sacrifice took place. And it was an interesting story and everyone had heard of it, but no one thought there was any truth to it. But that night, one of Stephen's friends, 21-year-old Jennifer Galbraith, dropped a bombshell on the group. She said, not only is the secret cave real, but that she had actually been to it and knows what's inside. And so of course they're like, give me a break. You have not been to the secret cave. It doesn't even exist. And she would say, no, I'm telling you the truth. I have been to something that I'm almost positive is the secret cave. And so the group's kind of smiling at her and they're like, all right, we'll indulge you. Tell us where the secret cave is and what's inside. She said the cave she went into was on Y Mountain, so that's right next to Brigham Young University. It was just north of the Seven Peaks golf course. And she said the actual entrance to the cave is inside of this little stretch of boulders where if you weren't looking closely, you couldn't even tell there was a space in between the boulders that you could walk down into. You would really have to be looking in between the boulders to see this little opening, where it descends about 10 or 15 feet to the cave floor. Once you climb down that, there's no water, it's just getting down to the entrance of the cave. Once you get down there and you're on the cave floor, in order to actually go into the cave, you need to hunch down because the ceiling of the cave is no higher than 4 feet, and at times it gets even lower. And so you crouch down, and you got your flashlight and you walk about 100 feet to the back of the cave and you'll see there's this beautiful little pool of crystal clear water. And if you shine your light into this pool of water, you'll see on the bottom, about 5 feet down, there is this little tiny opening just big enough for a person to get through. And that is the secret underwater tunnel that is 15 feet long and it leads up to an air pocket on the other side. Jen told the group that clearly this is not a sanctioned cave that you're allowed to go exploring in. In fact, if authorities knew about it, they probably would just block it off. But she said whoever had found it first had tied a rope from a rock on one side of the 15 feet underwater tunnel through the tunnel to the air pocket and it was tied to some wood on the other side. so that when you dove in head first into this little tiny tunnel, that you could basically pull the line and it would pull you through to the other side. Jen said she'd actually been to this cave just a couple of months earlier with another group of friends, and she said she was really scared about doing the underwater swim, but what she remembers about the experience, what really stood out to her, was how cold the water was. She said, I got to the other side no problem, but I was just so cold, I had to immediately turn around and go back out and warm up again. At this point, Stephen and the other friends are very intrigued by what Jen has just told them. She sounds like she's telling the truth, and it sounds like she definitely was in, some cave. Whether or not it was the secret cave or not, it really didn't matter. They were just really interested in this cave, which they were now referring to as the Cave of Death. And so they started saying to each other, hey, let's just go tonight. Let's go check out the Cave of Death tonight. And so by about 2, 3 in the morning, the group was like, yeah, let's go. And Stephen, unfortunately, he had to work the next day, so he couldn't go, even though he really wanted to. And so as the group headed off for Y Mountain, Stephen headed home. So the group of 5 arrives at the golf course parking lot, which is apparently at the base of where this cave entrance is going to be on this mountain, according to Jen's description. They hop out, they're wearing flip-flops and shorts, it's mild weather, and Jen assured them the walk up to the boulders, the entrance of this cave, it's not very far. And so they start walking up the mountain, and I'm sure some of the people in the group were pretty skeptical that this place even exists, but they keep on walking, and at some point Jen says there, and she points at a cluster of boulders, just like in her description. And so they walk over and they poke their heads over the boulder, and just like she described, there's this hole in the ground, and they shine their lights down into it, and it looks like there's that flat spot about 10 or 15 feet down, and the group can't believe it. This place really does exist. All of a sudden, the group is really energized. They're nervous, they're excited, and they're all kind of clambering their way down this 10 or 15 foot section down to that start point. And while they're making their way down, one of them, 26-year-old Joseph Ferguson, he's like, you know what? I don't really want to do this anymore. You guys can swim through the Tunnel of Death and the Cave of Death. I'm going to stay out here. We're probably not allowed to be in here anyway, so, I'll be the lookout, and I'll wait for you guys when you come out again. The other 4 chastised him briefly, but ultimately they didn't really care, and they turned their flashlights on, they turned around, and they crouched down, and they began walking through that low ceiling area down towards the pool of water. Joseph turned around, climbed up, and he sat on one of the boulders, and he looked down towards that little entrance area, and for a little while he could hear the group still talking as they made their way farther underground, and then eventually he couldn't hear them anymore. Joseph had no idea how long this whole process was supposed to take. Was it going to be 5 hours before he saw them again, or was it going to be 30 minutes? He didn't know. And so after an hour, he started to think, okay, this feels a little bit long. And so he climbed down off his boulder to that little entrance area, and he poked his head down and looked out across the area with the low ceiling to see if he could see flashlights or hear anything, but he didn't. And so after a little while, he climbed back up onto the boulder, and he waited another hour, and he still hasn't heard them yet. And he climbed down one more time, and he looked. Again, no light, no sound. And so at this point, he decides he has to call the police. Police and rescuers show up, and they were shocked that 1, this cave even existed, and 2, that no one had boarded it up yet because it was such a huge hazard. But either way, they began sucking water out of the tunnel and pumping air back in because Joseph had told them the group was going to be swimming through this tunnel where there was apparently this air pocket on the backside. And so they figured pump some air in there, keep them alive until we can get them out. The pumping lowered the water in the tunnel by about 2 feet, at which point rescuers could actually just go into the tunnel and they wouldn't need to hold their breath. And that's when they reached Jen's body about halfway through. She was angled in such a way that she must have been coming back from the air pocket, and the other 3 were stacked up right behind her. Investigators believe the group was able to successfully swim through the tunnel the first time into the air pocket. And they were in there for a little while. That can hold up to 8 people inside of there, plenty of air. And at some point they decided to go back. And so Jen was going to be the first one to swim back. She was the one that brought them in there. She'll be the one to bring them out. And the other 3, it's presumed, were right on her tail. Maybe they didn't want to be the last ones inside of this creepy dark cave, and they were worried that if they didn't go out with the group, they might get lost somehow. And so they all basically jumped in right after Jen. They're all right on top of each other going through this tunnel. And so Jen made it about halfway before she got stuck on something and she drowned. Now, the other 3 swimmers were right on top of her. And so when the second swimmer came up to Jen's body, they couldn't have gotten through. They might have tried, but there was no way to get through. It's pitch black. You're now blocked in front of you, and the other 2 swimmers are right behind you, blocking your way out. So the second swimmer is pinned in the middle of the tunnel. They can't move. They can go in reverse, but only if the 3rd and 4th swimmer in realize what's happening and they too go in reverse. And again, it's pitch black in a tight little tunnel, and they don't know what's going on. So second swimmer gets pinned. Third swimmer is really in the same position too. They're blocked by the second swimmer, and the fourth swimmer is blocking their retreat. And so the fourth swimmer is really the only one that had the ability to save anybody's life. They would have had to go in reverse and start that train of getting everybody to go out in reverse. But this is real life, and so what probably happened is Jen made it halfway through the tunnel before getting stuck and drowning. The other three, one by one, realized they were trapped inside of the tunnel. They couldn't go forward, they couldn't go back, they can't turn around, it's pitch black. Before long, they're thrashing and grabbing onto each other because they're panicking, and then they start inhaling water and they drown too. After the bodies were removed, there was some discussion about maybe finding a way to make the cave safe so people could go in there and enjoy it responsibly. But they looked at it and they said, there's just simply no way to make this cave safe. It's unbelievably dangerous, no matter what safety precautions we put in place. And so they decided to pour cement inside of it and cover it with rocks. And their only regret is they didn't find it sooner to do that sooner, because they could have prevented this tragedy. White Island in New Zealand is one of the world's most accessible volcanoes, with only a third of its cone protruding from the water and one of its walls having fallen in, creating a sort of natural drawbridge. All it takes is a 90-minute boat ride or a 20-minute helicopter ride, and you could be stepping off directly into the crater. The island has a definite menace to it, with the acrid air and the acid lake inside of an inner depression and the abandoned sulfur mine where in 1914, 10 men were swept away to their deaths by a mud avalanche. When this mine closed in the 1930s, the island was largely forgotten about for several decades until the 1990s, when adventure tourism really started to heat up around the globe, and locals in New Zealand started taking advantage by offering boat rides and plane rides out to this kind of otherworldly volcano island. And soon, guidebooks were calling a tour of White Island an unmissable trip. Once on the island, tourists were taken on a very established route that started on the southern end of the island on a jetty. They'd walk up a dirt path, they'd go directly through the crater down to this inner depression where they could look over at this acid lake, and then they'd turn around and they'd walk right back, passing by the abandoned sulfur mine on their way back to the jetty. Tourists of all ages could complete this route in about an hour and a half. This volcano is very closely monitored by a geological monitoring service called GeoNet. Every day, they rate the danger this island presents on a 0 to 5 scale, and tours are only allowed to take place if it's 0, 1, or 2. Anything above 2 and it's too dangerous. On November 19th, 2019, GeoNet rated the danger of the island as a 2, saying that it looks like, eruptive activity is more likely, but still safe for tourism. Now, make no mistake, anybody that went out to White Island was made fully aware of the risks of going out to the island, including that rating system. Hey, today's a 2, so it's on the upper bounds of what's acceptable. But that was part of the thrill of going out to White Island. It was like you're brushing up with death, but it feels really safe because the guides are out there with you and they're kind of joking about how it might erupt any day. You could be enveloped in an acid mist and obliterated by rocks, and people thought that was like kind of fun. And so when the rating was bumped up to a 2, suddenly people were more inclined to go. It was more exhilarating. Fast forward a few weeks to December 9th, the GeoNet rating is still at a 2, and 5 groups of tourists headed out that morning for White Island. You had 3 big groups that were in 3 separate boats, and you had 2 smaller groups that were in their own helicopter. They made their way out and they arrived around 1 p.m. and they began staggering tours up the path, down into the crater, down to the acid lake, and then back out again. By about 2 p.m., 2 of the large groups that came in on boats had finished their tour, got back on their boats, and were ferrying around just offshore, taking pictures of the island, and 1 of the 2 helicopter groups had already boarded their helicopter and taken off. At 2:09 p.m., 47 tourists and guides were still on the island. 26 were down near the jetty waiting to board their boat to leave, and 21 were still deep inside of the crater. 1 minute later, at 2:10 p.m., one of the cameras operated by GeoNet to measure volcanic activity on the island snapped this picture of the 21 people down in the crater. Now, the image is not clear enough to make out individuals, but you can clearly see body shapes, and it looks like they are relaxed, walking in a straight line, making their way back to the jetty. For all but 3 of them, this would be the final picture of them taken alive. 1 minute later, at 2:11 p.m., the volcano erupted, consuming almost everyone inside of the crater, sending steam and ash and acidic mist 2 miles into the air, followed immediately by another explosion that went horizontally, firing rocks and more acid and boiling steam in all directions. Of the 47 people that were still on the island when it erupted, 19 died instantly and 2 more would succumb to their injuries later. These survivors required so many skin grafts that New Zealand put out a global order for 33.8 square meters, the equivalent of 16 bodies worth. One tourist named Alessandro Kaufman was on White Island that day. He was one of the tourists that was in one of the 5 groups of people that went out. He was in one of the boats, and he was one of the last people to get off right before it erupted, literally minutes before. And he was filming as his boat was loitering just offshore, waiting for the last 47 people to leave the island. Here's what he shot.
Só embarcar.
Morning.
The crater lake level sat there for about 2 years. Then in 2000. Iniciamos às 10, são quase 2 horas da tarde, finalizando aqui. É isso, agora partiu pro continente. Man, look. Jeez. I don't know. Come on. Let's get off of here. Jesus.
On July 29th, 2008, a little after midnight, a 40-year-old man named Vince Lee boarded a Greyhound bus bound for Winnipeg, Canada, using a fake name. He had left his house abruptly without telling his wife where he was going, but he left her a note, which she would later give to police, and the note just said, "I'm gone, don't look for me, I wish you were happy." Vince rode the bus for 5.5 hours without sleeping and got off when it stopped in Erickson. And the bus driver would say to him, "Hey, this is not your stop, you want to get off at Winnipeg." And Vince apparently just did not turn around, didn't react to him, didn't even seem to hear him, and just calmly walked away. And so the driver eventually just kind of shrugged his shoulders, closed the doors, and headed off. Shortly after the bus left, Vince was spotted sitting on a nearby bench holding a sign that said "Laptop for sale, $600. And over the course of the rest of that day and all night, Vince was spotted by multiple people, not moving, not sleeping, sitting upright, looking straight out, not even blinking. The next day, on July 30th, a 15-year-old boy would approach Vince and offer to buy his laptop for $60. And Vince agreed, gave him the laptop for $60. Once the kid walked off with his laptop, Vince got up, went behind a nearby store, and burned some of his belongings before going back to the bus stop he had gotten off at the day before and waited for the bus. A little while later, at 5:55 p.m., Greyhound bus 1170 arrived at the Erickson bus stop, opened their doors, and Vince climbed on board and sat in one of the front seats. Sitting in one of the last seats in the bus was a 22-year-old father named Tim McLean, who had boarded the bus 5.5 hours earlier in Alberta, Canada, after a long stretch working at a carnival. When he got on board, he was exhausted, so he went to the back of the bus, put his headphones in, leaned his head against the glass, and had fallen asleep. And when Vince got on board, that's what Tim was doing. He was still sleeping in the back. As soon as the bus left the Erickson bus stop, some of the 36 other passengers on board would say Vince was acting very strange. He was looking down and muttering to himself, and at one point Vince got up and he was pacing up and down the aisle towards the front of the bus. When the bus made a quick stop, Vince stood up, moved to the very back of the bus, and sat directly next to Tim in the same seat. Tim woke up, turned over, looked at Vince, gave him a quick smile, and then rolled back over and fell asleep, unfazed. The bus started moving again, and then a little while later, at 8:30 p.m., Vince stood up and went to the bathroom in the back of the bus. and some of the other passengers noticed he had a large knife in a sheath on his belt. 5 minutes later, Tim is still fast asleep against the window. Vince comes out of the bathroom and he goes back into his seat, but instead of sitting down, he puts his right knee on his seat and plants his left foot on the ground right in front of his seat, so he's facing Tim. He pulls his knife out of the sheath and drives it into Tim's neck. Tim woke up and he was trying to fight him off of him and he was screaming for help, but Vince was robotic and unemotional, just continuously attacking Tim until he went still. Other passengers were half asleep when this started, and so it took a minute before it registered with everyone what was going on, and quickly people started screaming, and then the bus driver pulled over and people were clamoring to get out of the bus. Once off the bus, a couple of the male passengers decided they had to go back in and try to save Tim, but when they walked up the steps and looked down the aisle, they saw Vince had pulled Tim out into the aisle. Vince's back was to the front of the bus, and they could tell that Tim's head was no longer on his body. At this point, Vince whipped his head around and looked at the 3 men that had come on the bus, and he jumped up and charged them with the knife, at which point the 3 men retreated and ran out of the bus, and luckily one of them was the driver, who was able to initiate the security system on the bus that made it immobile so Vince couldn't drive it away, and it shut permanently the doors until you deactivated the security system. Vince tried to push the doors open, but he couldn't do it, so he went back up and continued to attack Tim's body. While waiting for the police to show up, horrified onlookers had to watch Vince as he continued to attack Tim, and in fact at one point Vince began eating Tim and actually held his body up to show them what he was doing. Finally, the police arrived, and after a standoff, Vince leapt out of one of the windows and was tased repeatedly and then arrested. Once in custody, he said he was sorry, but he also said the reason he did it was God was speaking to him while he was sitting on the bus, and he was instructing him that Tim was an alien who was going to attack him, and so he needed to go kill the alien to save the world. In a controversial turn of events, Vince Lee was found not criminally responsible for the death of Tim McLean, and so was not given jail time. He was sent to a treatment program that, after he finished, he was fully released. He was allowed to change his name. He has no restrictions. He has no supervision. He is a totally free man. Just minutes after Vince was apprehended by police, one of the passengers who had been sitting near Tim when the attack started gave an interview where he described what happened. Here are segments of his interview.
I was just reading a book. All of a sudden I heard a guy screaming. I turned around and the guy sitting right next beside me was standing up and stabbing another guy with a Rambo knife. Repeatedly. Everybody got off the bus. Me and a trucker that had stopped and the Greyhound driver ran up to the door to maybe see if the guy was still alive or we could help or something like that. And at that point when we saw the head, we knew that the guy was dead. So then he saw us. He came back to the front of the bus, told the driver to shut the door. He pressed the button and the door shut. The 3 of us had weapons from the trucker's truck there, and we just stayed outside while he tried to get out the door. Telling him, no, stay put, stay there, don't try to come out. Some people were puking, some people were crying. The guy, he didn't care at all. He wasn't concerned with anybody but the guy that he stabbed was listening to his headphones and sleeping. I honestly don't think that the guy knew him at all. I think he was just really crazy.
John Lin was a 33-year-old international undergraduate student from Wuhan, China. He moved to Montreal, Canada in 2010 to study engineering and computer science. And according to his best friend, Benjamin Zhu, Lin had also moved to Canada because Lin was actually gay, just not openly. And back home in China, he had hid that from his family and from society because he felt pressure to, conform. And he had even married a woman to keep up appearances. But that relationship ended in divorce, and he ultimately decided, I need to be myself. I need to go someplace that can allow me to do that. And he saw Canada as that place. So Lin gets to Montreal, and by all accounts, he's really pleased with the accepting and liberal culture there. It was everything he hoped it would be. But Lin was notoriously shy and reserved, and after living in Canada for about a year or so, he hadn't really built a very big network at all. He only had a handful of very close friends. Lin did go out and get a cat that he absolutely adored and treated like a baby, and it seems like the cat might have been his closest companion in that first year and a half. But in early 2012, Lin finally reached a point where he was like, you know what? I need to put myself out there and make some new friends. I need to get uncomfortable to expand my network a little bit. And so he went on Craigslist in hopes that he would find someone basically asking for a friend. He would find an ad from a guy named Luca Magnotta, who was roughly his age, who was asking for guys that wanted to be in a homemade movie with him. But he explicitly said in the post that it was nothing inappropriate. It was just a fun homemade movie. And apparently Lynn thought, this is exactly what I'm looking for. This is an easy way to make a friend. And he reached out to Luca and the two set a date to meet up. Unfortunately for Lynn, this Craigslist ad was bait. 1 year before Luca posted that Craigslist ad asking for someone to be in his movie with him, he had made another kind of movie. It was called One Boy, Two Kittens, and it was Luca filming himself suffocating two cats to death. Luca posted this video anonymously and took great measures to ensure on camera he didn't give anything away about himself. He wanted to shock the world with this video, but he didn't want to get caught. Now, once this video started getting spread around the internet and people saw that this wasn't a hoax, it was a real horrible video, a large Facebook group was started with the sole purpose being, let's figure out who did this. Let's figure out who made this video. And they painstakingly went through every single scene in this horrible video, and they were able to pull quite a bit of information about who the person was that created this video, but they didn't have enough information to identify who it really was. But when Luca uploaded a second and then third video of him again harming more cats, this Facebook group started to recognize a pattern. Luca was incorporating very specific music into the background of these videos, as well as a couple of posters that were intentionally placed in the shot of these videos. And it became clear that Luca was trying to recreate certain scenes from certain movies. And it was through these movie references that they determined Luca was in Canada, and then using one of the still shots from a picture he had posted, they figured out exactly in Canada where he was. And so they felt like they had finally nailed this guy, and they reach out to Canadian authorities and they say, hey, we have this guy, he's harming animals and he's showing all the signs that he's gonna do this to a human at some point. We know exactly where he lives, we know his name, we know everything about him. Here you go arrest this guy. But the Canadian authorities basically said, it's just cats. We really can't do much about this. And they sat on it. They didn't do anything. Fast forward to May 24th, 2012, and it's the day that Lynn and Luca Magnotta are supposed to meet up to make this fun movie. There is security footage of Lynn meeting up with Luca right outside of Luca's apartment in Montreal, Canada. They walk up to the front door. Lynn has a yellow shirt on. Luca has a white shirt on. Luca opens the door, Lynn follows after him, and the two walk down the hall and up the stairs and out of view. They make their way up to room 208, that was Luca's apartment. They go inside and Luca offers Lynn some wine that he had put some very heavy sedative into, and Lynn didn't know this. Lynn drinks the wine and he becomes lethargic and tired, but he's not totally unconscious. Luca brings Lynn over to the bed and he has him lay down, and then he ties his arms and his legs to the bed as he's laying on his back. And then Luca turns on some music and he gets a camera on a tripod and he sets it up at the base of the bed looking at Lynn. Luca hits record and you can see that Lynn is still conscious and moving around, but he's not fighting back in any way. Luca walks up to the side of the bed and he kind of pats Lynn on the head before getting on top of him, pulling out an ice pick and brutally killing Lynn on camera with this ice pick. Afterwards, Luca gets off the bed. He puts on Lynn's yellow t-shirt that he had been wearing, and Luca just casually leaves his apartment and comes back with a bag filled with cleaning materials and gloves. But before he goes in to the apartment, the security camera picks him up, stopping and looking at his own reflection and checking to make sure his hair was perfectly placed behind his ears, as if there's nothing more important right now than his appearance, even though literally minutes earlier you just savagely killed someone on camera. After ensuring his hair was in just the right position, he casually walks back into the apartment building, up to his room, into the room where Lynn is. He brings him into the bathroom and chops him into pieces. He kept a few smaller pieces for himself that he eventually ate. He wrapped up the hands and feet, which he ultimately mailed to the Canadian government, and then the rest of Lynn was cut into fairly small pieces and put into trash bags. And then over the next several hours, Luca would make dozens of trips from his room down to the basement of the apartment building where he would dispose of these bags in the dumpster. The next day, on May 25th, 2012, Luca anonymously uploaded an 11-minute video called One Lunatic, One Ice Pick to the shock website Best Gore. The video was of Luca killing John Lynn. When the Facebook group that had been tracking Luca for his animal cruelty saw this video, this One Lunatic, One Ice Pick video, they instantly knew this is Luca, and they told the police and they showed them all the evidence from previous videos and why this is definitely Luca. And the police listened, and they were able to find Luca sitting in an internet cafe in Berlin, Germany, Googling himself. Luca would try to use insanity as his defense, but the Facebook group had shared with the police, and then the police shared with the prosecutors, that Luca was actually just reenacting scenes from some of his favorite movies. It was this bizarre fantasy he had, and what he did to John Lynn is eerily similar to the opening scene of Luca's favorite movie of all time, Basic Instinct. In the movie, a woman is sitting on a man who's tied up on a bed, and she reaches under the sheets and she pulls out an ice pick and proceeds to kill the man with it. Luca was quickly found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. I decided to leave out any of the footage from One Lunatic, One Ice Pick. It's truly one of the most distressing things I've ever seen, so if you want to see that, that's up to you. Instead, I included the footage of Luca and Lynn going into the apartment building together, and then Luca coming down sometime later after having killed Lynn, now wearing Lynn's shirt, and then makes all those trips to the dumpster as he's disposing of Lynn's body. In February of 2019, a young man named Austin and his family moved to Houston, Texas. As soon as they arrived and they had their stuff pulled off the vehicles, Austin went out looking for a job. Because he was brand new to the area and his family was really tight on cash, he started looking for jobs that people didn't necessarily want, the types of jobs that would hire him really quickly. And luckily, 5 minutes down the road from his house was a gas station that was looking for someone to take the dreaded 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. Austin went over there, he applied, and was quickly given the job, and quickly realized how miserable it is to sleep all day and work all night. 3 months later, in May, Austin woke up one evening to get ready for work, and he realized the power was out. So he left his bedroom and headed downstairs where his father was, and he asked him, how long has the power been out? And his dad told him that basically as soon as Austin had come home from his last shift, it had gone out, and the power company says it's going to be a while before it comes back on again. Austin stepped outside onto his front porch underneath the overhang, and it was pouring rain. And in fact, it had been raining when he had come back from his last shift, and looking out at his front yard and the streets, which were all flooded, it was clear it had just not stopped raining. And he's looking around, and all the houses are completely dark, the streetlights are even dark, so this power outage is pretty massive. Austin wasn't sure if he was going to need to go into work that day because of the flooding and the power outage, so he called his manager and he asked her, and she would say that yes, we do need you to come in, but not for your normal job because the store is without power like everyone else. What we want you to do is just sit inside the store with the doors locked to prevent looting. Feeling a little let down that he still had to work, Austin grabbed a cup of coffee, put on his rain boots and his rain jacket, and ran out to his car. The drive to work was surreal. Not only was it totally dark because there was basically no streetlights on and all the houses are dark, but as Austin was driving, the roads were flooded, but because there was no light, it was very difficult to gauge how deep these puddles were. And on the road, periodically, he would see cars that had miscalculated the depths of these puddles and clearly had gotten stuck, and the driver had just abandoned their vehicle. He described the scene as feeling like something out of a zombie apocalypse movie. Austin finally got to the gas station parking lot, which was slightly elevated, so there was a whole bunch of cars that had been left in the lot, presumably to avoid being flooded. And so he pulls into a spot and he sees his manager is in the store. She sees him. He hops out of the car. He runs up to the door. She unlocks it. She lets him in. She shuts it and locks it behind him. Austin had never been inside the store without power on, and he said what struck him as soon as he walked in was not just that it was totally dark, but it was totally quiet. All the drink machines and the cooler and all the kind of ambient sounds were all gone, and it was just totally quiet. He turned to his manager, who was using her phone as a flashlight, and she said to him, "Look, there's not much for you to do here, so keep the doors shut, let me know if you need anything, and if the power comes back on again, open the store as usual." She handed him the keys and left out the front door. He locked the door behind her and then walked over to one of the tables inside, up against the side of the store. When he sat down, he got out his phone to start watching some YouTube videos to kill the time, but he quickly saw that there was no internet service, and he figured, well, I guess the power outage must have affected internet providers. And so now, totally bored without the internet, he got up and got a couple energy drinks, and he sat down at this table and just smashed energy drinks and watched the rain. And after about an hour of doing that, he was still really bored, and he thought, you know, I've always wanted to do vlogging, and so why not start vlogging right now? So he gets his phone out and he props it up on the table and he starts recording himself. And so for the next couple of hours, Austin talked into his camera about the storm, about the power outage, about sports, about movies, about all sorts of things. His intent was not really to create a concise vlog so much as to just stay awake doing something. And it was working. He enjoyed doing it. And then around 3 a.m., as he's sitting there talking to his camera, you hear the unmistakable sound of someone banging really hard on the inside of the coolers on the other side of the store. And Austin immediately stops talking and turns his head and looks. And he hears it again. Very distinct pounding coming from the other side of the building. At this point, Austin is still looking. He's not even flinching. He's just staring in the direction of the sound. And then he turns back to the camera when he hears a third sound that doesn't sound like pounding, but it sounds like something else coming from that side of the room. And after that third sound, he's had enough. He gets up, he walks out of the store, locks it behind him, and gets in his car. He doesn't go back inside the store for the rest of his shift, and when his manager shows up, he honks the horn to get her to come over. And she's like, "What are you doing out here? Why aren't you in the store like you're supposed to be?" And he just shows her the video. As she's watching the video, she's clearly startled by the footage, and at the end of it, she confesses to Austin that lately, employees have been telling her they're hearing weird banging sounds coming from the cooler, and that she had gone in there to check if maybe there was an animal or just something that was causing the sound, and she said she couldn't find it. After this, Austin's manager went inside the store and looked around, and there was no one inside, there was no one in the cooler, and she reviewed the footage of inside and outside the store over the past 12 to 24 hours, and the only people that had come near the store were her and Austin. Austin quit his job there 2 weeks later. Here is some of the footage of Austin inside the gas station.
It is pouring. All day it's been pouring. So I went outside to go check, and our street was flooded. And in front of his You hear that? Something is moving around in the cooler. Screw all that noise.
In 2009, a man named Joe Cummings was living in a New York City apartment when he started to notice food in his refrigerator was going missing. Joe led a very hectic lifestyle and did not spend that much time in his apartment, so he thought perhaps, I've been in a rush lately and I've been eating more food than I realize. He started paying more attention to how much he was eating, and whenever he put food back in the fridge, he was really aware of just how much was left when he put it back in. But over and over again, he'd take the food back out again, and it was like someone had eaten another 25% of what he had left. It quickly got to a point where he could not rationalize why the food was missing. He knew it wasn't him, so the only other person it could be would be his girlfriend, who did live with him, but she never touched his food. But since there was no one else to ask, he went up to his girlfriend and said, "Are you eating my food?" And she at first was just really confused because she hadn't heard about this, and then was like, "No, I'm not touching your food. I have my own food. I don't eat your food." As convincing as she might have been, Joe was kind of backed into a corner. There was no other reasonable explanation for why the food was missing. So he decided he would set up a hidden camera in his kitchen to catch his girlfriend eating his food. So that day he went out and got a camera, came back, set it up, made sure it worked, and then he hit record and went to bed. The next day, when he reviewed the footage, he knew immediately that it was not his girlfriend. Joe would post his hidden camera footage to YouTube in a video he called "Creeper in My Apartment." The video starts with Joe adjusting the camera so it's lined up the way he wants it. Then it fast forwards a couple of hours and you hear a sound coming from somewhere in the kitchen. And then this woman emerges out of the cupboard and very carefully extends her foot down to a table and gets down onto the kitchen floor and makes sure Joe has not hurt her. Afterwards, she goes into his fridge and she's drinking milk right out of the carton. And then at some point, Joe actually comes into the kitchen and she has to dive out of the way and hides from him. When he leaves, she gets up, she takes some food, and she goes right back up into the cupboard. The video ends with Joe walking into the kitchen the next morning, totally oblivious to what happened the night before, and going in his fridge and drinking from the same carton that she had drank from. When Joe reviewed the footage, he immediately called the police, who came over and they pulled her out of the cupboard and they arrested her. Joe believes she must have snuck in from the fire escape because it leads up to a window that he couldn't lock in the back of his apartment. And the police said that based on what they found in the space she was living in up in the cupboard, that she probably was there for at least 2 weeks. Here are some highlights from Joe's "Creeper in My Apartment" video. The day after Christmas in 2010, and Catherine Kleiss was really excited about the upcoming week. She and her husband, Jack Wheeler, had started this tradition where the week between Christmas and New Year's, they would turn off their cell phones, close their laptops, they wouldn't work, and they would just sit around watching movies together the whole week. But that day, Jack would tell Catherine, much to her dismay, that he wasn't going to be around for that week because he had business in Washington, D.C., and it was really important and he couldn't miss it. Catherine was really upset and disappointed and initially kind of lashed out at Jack, but Catherine would say that she wasn't exactly surprised. Jack was a prominent consultant and a former Pentagon official. He traveled a ton for work. So Jack leaves for this trip, and Catherine kind of anticipates that they're not going to speak while he's gone. They didn't really end on good terms, and typically when they fought, they would go long periods of time without talking to each other. But as much as Catherine wanted to be stubborn and not talk to him, they had a wedding they were supposed to go to together at the end of the week, and Catherine needed to coordinate travel with Jack. And so after a couple of days that he's been in DC and she hasn't heard from from him, she puts her ego aside and she calls him. Her call went straight to voicemail. And then she called a couple more times, and again, all of them went straight to voicemail. She texted him, no response. She emailed him, no response. Catherine interprets this as Jack trying to ignore her, and she's furious. And she ends up going to the wedding by herself. After the wedding was over, she gets back to her house, and she still hasn't heard from Jack, but she's so mad and so stubborn that he was doing this on purpose, she still didn't think anything was wrong. She really believed that he was stonewalling her. But on January 2nd, 2011, Catherine would get a phone call that would show her that Jack was never stonewalling her. He was never ignoring her. He was dead. Back on the day after Christmas, right after Jack has told Catherine that, sorry, I'm not going to be around this week, he gathers up his things and he heads to the Amtrak train station and boards a train to Washington, D.C. Jack arrives in Washington, D.C., and for the next couple of days, he has a very ordinary business trip. On December 28th, the day he's supposed to come home, things get a little bit weird. Instead of going back to New York, where he lived with Catherine, he bought a train ticket to go to Wilmington, Delaware. Now, he owned a house about 20 minutes away from Wilmington, but he had never indicated to Catherine or to anyone in his family that he'd be spending any time at this residence following this trip. No one knows what Jack did that night in Delaware or where he stayed. All we know is on the following day, on December 29th, he got in a cab and asked to go to a particular hotel in Wilmington. The police would get in touch with this cab driver who would say he was completely normal. He just looked like a business guy that wanted to go to this hotel. We had small talk in the cab and I dropped him off and that was it. Around 9:30 in the morning that day, Jack sends an email to his company that says his home has been broken into and his cell phone along with his badge, his work badge, and a key fob and his briefcase have all been stolen. After that email, we don't know what Jack did over the course of that day because he was not spotted again until 6 p.m. that night when he walked into a pharmacy and walked up to a random pharmacist and said, "Hey, can you give me a ride somewhere?" The pharmacist would tell police that when Jack came in there and asked him for a ride, he looked really upset, but overall, more or less put together. He had a suit on, he looked like he genuinely just needed some help, but the pharmacist just had a weird feeling about it and said, "Look, I can't give you a ride, but I'd be happy to call you a cab." Jack would decline the offer for a cab and would leave the pharmacy. 40 minutes later, a surveillance camera in a parking garage would capture Jack acting totally bizarre. He walks into frame and immediately it's like something's off about him. His suit looks kind of wrinkled and rumpled and he's walking with a limp and he's only got one shoe on because the other shoe is being held in his other hand for some reason. He goes up to the attendant and he points his finger at them like he's upset about something. And apparently what he was saying to them is, "Someone stole my briefcase," but there's no audio on the footage. And then he turns and walks down the hall and he opens up a door into the garage, pokes his head around like he's looking for something, shuts the door and comes back. And apparently he was saying to the attendant, "I'm looking for my car, can you help me find it?" And no one really knew what to do with the guy. And just as quickly as he had arrived and made this kind of weird scene, he abruptly left and didn't tell anyone where he was going. Nobody knows where he went after the parking garage or where he stayed that night, but the next day on December 30th, Jack walked into this high-rise office building. He goes right up to the front desk attendant in the lobby and he asked to speak with a managing partner at one of the law firms that was inside of this office building. The attendant calls up to the law firm and the lawyer is notified, who says he'll be down in a minute, but by the time he got down to the lobby to meet with Jack, Jack was gone. We don't know what Jack did after he left the office building, but several hours later that night, Jack is picked up to the north of this building in an area called Rodney Square, and he's making his way over to the relatively dangerous part of the city known as the East Side. Jack had also changed his outfit at this point. He was now wearing a sweatshirt with the hood up. The next time anybody saw Jack, he was being poured out of a dump truck into a landfill and he was dead. The worker who spotted Jack's body being poured into the landfill called the police. The police show up and they were able to determine, based on the truck that Jack had been in, that he was picked up from a dumpster that was in Newark, Delaware, not Wilmington, Delaware, which means Jack's body was somehow in a dumpster 13 miles away from where he was last seen on camera in Rodney Square. Police quickly ruled this a homicide, and it was determined that his cause of death was blunt force trauma. He had been beaten to death. But to this day, no one has any idea who did it or why Jack was acting as strangely as he was in those final few days in Delaware. Now, his wife and his family have watched the videos of him on surveillance acting very strangely, and they say he's not acting crazy. He's acting scared. Here is the surveillance footage of Jack when he was at the parking garage walking around with one shoe on. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know what you thought of these 3 stories in the comment section, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's melatonin pills with caffeine pills. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it, guys. See ya.